Good morning. I'm Meghan O'Sullivan. I'm a professor at Harvard and the director of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University. It's a real pleasure to welcome you here and to welcome you to what I understand is the first conversation, maybe not the first conversation, but the first gathering about energy and climate at Davos this week. So it's our real pleasure to join you to launch what will be an engaging week of conversations on this topic. And we have a fabulous panel, which I'll introduce in just a moment. So the energy transition is, by, I would say, almost any metric, one of the most or the most ambitious, intentional action that humanity has ever undertaken. And many of us in this room are acutely, in some cases personally, aware of the incredible advances that we've seen over the last decades and over the last decade in particular, whether it has to do with technologies or the trillions, now almost $2 trillion in 2024, invested in clean energy technologies. But all of this has not amounted to anything that we could really qualify as success at this point. We're finding that the energy transition, despite the imperative that many attach to it, is meeting some very formidable headwinds. And we'll discuss them, but I put them sort of in three baskets. First is just the resurgence of energy security as a priority for policymakers and for citizens. It shouldn't be a surprise that when people are faced with two imperatives of reducing a carbon footprint and securing affordable, plentiful energy, that the latter would win out. But this is, in fact, what has happened around the world. The second headwind of the energy transition is just geopolitics. You think of a world which wasn't so long ago where the US and China had a cooperative relationship, and the global dynamic was largely one of a cooperative dynamic. We're in a very different geopolitical world today where the US-China competition is fierce and is a defining dynamic in the landscape. This, of course, has had many implications for the energy transition and for energy security. And then lastly, I would point out, and it is highlighted by the incoming president of the United States, President Trump, inaugurated yesterday, the shift in politics, not just in America, but in other places, where the priority has seemed quite definitively to shift away from the energy transition and towards the development of fossil fuels. So where does this leave these kinds of conversations? Some people would say perhaps despair is an appropriate emotion. But I would say there's rather an opportunity here. There's really a need for new thinking, for conceiving the energy transition in a way that's different. What we have been doing thus far has obviously not met the moment. The energy transition, as it has been pursued, has not brought in the global south and won it over entirely to it. It has not reduced emissions, and it has not tackled demand for fossil fuel. So we need to think of the energy transition in a different kind of way, in a way that recognizes an energy transition that does not take into account energy security is not going to be a successful transition. And so how do we develop this new thinking? It starts with conversations, and I hope these are conversations that are going to be qualitatively different than the ones we've had in the past, that really begin with kind of as I say to my students at Harvard, analysis, not advocacy. Really looking at the facts, looking at the economics, and looking at the politics for what they are. And I think there's no better place than to launch some of these conversations than here at Davos, at the World Economic Forum. And we have a fantastic panel in which to do it. Just moving from right to left, I'd like to first briefly introduce Jonathan Price, who's the CEO of Teck Resources, a Canadian mining company. And next to him is Minister Maria de Carvalho, and she is the Portuguese Minister for Energy, Environment and Energy. And sitting next to Maria is Mr. Mohammed Taufik, and he is the President and CEO of PETRONAS from Malaysia. And then next to him is Kgosientso Ramokgopa, who is the South African Minister for Electricity and Energy. And then sitting immediately to my left is Dr. Fatih Birol, the Executive Director of the International Energy Agency. So again, looking forward to a fantastic conversation with this group. Fatih, I'd like to begin with you, if I may, and just see if you would like to comment a little bit on what I opened up with. Just this sense that the energy transition, the imperative of reining in carbon emissions or getting to a net zero economy, global economy, is still as urgent as ever, yet some of this urgency feels as if it's been dissipated by other priorities. And I didn't even mention AI and the drive for electricity and power to fuel the AI innovations, which are seen as critical to national security by many. Could you give us a sense of, do you feel like other priorities are impeding the energy transition, and how might these geopolitical and geoeconomic developments have an impact, and what might we do about it?
Many thanks, Meghan, and also framing it in a perfect way, the discussion. And you mentioned a lot of, rightly so, the uncertainties, political, economic uncertainties. And if I am not wrong, I think it's overall title of this very Davos is about the uncertainties. Yes, there are many uncertainties. This is right, but I think we shouldn't lose ourselves and lose our perspective by looking at all these uncertainties. And I want to highlight a couple of certainties. Number one, energy security. The energy security challenges of today, the oil and gas energy security, and an energy security challenges of tomorrow, critical minerals, supply chains, and the others. This is a certainty, and it will stay with us. Climate change, it is real. It is happening, and it will be worsened if we don't change our policies. This is a certainty. Today, this year, ladies and gentlemen, more than 500,000 women and children die prematurely in Africa because they don't have access to clean cooking. This is a certainty. And there are some other certainties when we look at the markets. The cost of batteries last year decreased by 20%. So are some of the other clean energy technologies. Nuclear power, as IEA has predicted 3 years ago, is making a comeback, a strong comeback. And when we look at the investment for electricity sector is overtaking the investment of oil plus gas plus coal put together. So therefore, what I'm saying is uncertainties are right. They are happening around the world, political, economic, and in the energy sector. But we shouldn't lose the sight that there are some certainties. Now, as far as the energy security challenges, maybe two remarks. I don't want to steal the time of my colleagues, but two remarks. One, both for today's and tomorrow's energy security, for me, there is one magic word: diversification. Diversification of the energy technologies, the importing, exporting country, and the routes. Over-dependencies can quickly turn into serious vulnerabilities. In Europe, we have witnessed this 2 years ago. Diversification is very important. And finally, for me, a successful clean energy transition is the one which makes the energy systems much more secure and resilient, makes the energy prices affordable, and at the same time reduces the reliance on other countries which have the reputation of being not a reliable partner. So energy transition, in my view, is not only reducing or aim to reduce the emissions, but at the same time provides prosperity to its people and also makes the energy much more secure. This is the definition of the right energy transition for me, and as such, a real energy transition program, in my view, is not a rival of energy security. They can all be together. They should be all together if they are done properly.
Great. Thank you, Fatih. Maria, I might turn to you with the same question, just building on what Fatih said about diversification being the key to a successful energy transition and resilience. Of course, Europe comes to mind with all the challenges that it has seen since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Could you give us a sense of how you are seeing the imperative of the energy transition in a European context, given the other challenges?
Thank you very much. Good morning to all of you, and thank you for the invitation to be here. It's a pleasure to be here talking about the energy transition, a policy that is so important into my country, Portugal. We had problems in the past when the society was mainly dependent on fossil fuels, and we have done a decision several years ago to invest on the energy transition. So for security of supply, for combating climate change, and also air quality, that's a very important factor, and third and very important for competitiveness. The energy transition is the greatest economic factor to attract investment to Portugal. We have access to affordable renewable electricity and renewable hydrogen that will attract the investment to our country. Last year in 24, we achieved 71% of renewables in the electricity production, about 28 hydro, 27 wind, 10 solar, 6 biomass. And we have a plan, we have our National Energy and Climate Plan that was supported by, we have in our parliament 30 members of the parliament, only 4 didn't support this plan. So we have an overall majority supporting our transition, and that is very, very important. So we will have this ambition to become 93 in 2030, 93% of renewables in electricity production and 51% in the global energy. So we have to do a transition on transport and buildings, and transport is our biggest challenge. We are also putting a lot of emphasis on and investing on grids and on storage, and attracting investment on the production of hydrogen. And as I said, we do this as a competitiveness factor to attract investment to our country. Very important is also our internal market with Spain. So we are in certain ways still an island. It has been difficult to build the interconnections to France. So we have to get stronger together to have an Iberian internal market, and to build that with a lot of renewables, with a lot of storage. We have now developing a common or a parallel strategy for storage in order to become more and more independent. We are quite independent on Russian gas. We had in 21 around 15% of importing. Last year we are down to 5%. We have the figures from January to November, and we only import 5%, and we hope to decrease even more. So we import mainly from Nigeria, United States, and that is our measure, and I think that is the line to take, to be more independent, to invest in renewables, in order to do this transition in a more swift way and sustainable way.
Great. Thank you very much, Maria. Jonathan, I'd like to turn and talk a little bit about the mining industry. And of course, the mining industry is one of the industries whose fortunes have changed dramatically with the energy transition. A successful transition will require meeting the greatly increased demand, as the IEA has pointed out, in all kinds of minerals and other materials, be it steel, be it lithium, be it copper, rare earths, whatever the case may be. This would seem to translate into a boon for companies and countries that have interests in mining, but this has not always been a linear progression, that it has been sometimes a difficult one to navigate. Jonathan, if I could ask you, why is this the case? Why is there not such an obvious translation from the need for these minerals and materials and the benefits that go to companies and countries that are involved in these industries? And what might change to make this more transparent, reliable, and straightforward?
Yes, you're right in that this is a great time to be in the mining industry because the demand signal is a huge one coming from the energy transition broadly, and critical minerals sit upstream of every sort of mega trend we're seeing now, whether that's related to energy transition, whether that's electrification, whether that's AI and compute. Critical minerals are going to be required to enable that, and just focusing particularly on copper, because copper is one of the largest, more mature markets in the critical minerals area. We see over the next 10 years an increase in demand of about 25%, and by 2040, an increase in demand of about 40%. And those numbers might not sound very large. However, there are some real constraints on the supply side here that go to your question as perhaps to why we're not meeting that increased demand right now. Firstly, the existing mines we have are aging. These mines, copper mines in particular, they suffer from grade decline throughout their life. It's just nature doing its work essentially. But what that means is, in the absence of investment, we produce less year over year. Secondly, as we look at new mines, these mines are deeper, they're lower grades, they're also in more difficult geographies, not just in terms of country risk, but we're looking at future mines above 5,000 meters in Argentina, for example. That's an incredibly difficult environment in which to construct an operation and run an operation. And then there are additional costs associated with building these mines that we haven't experienced previously, and these rightly come from societal expectations. But it's also things like access to water. We're increasingly having to build desalination plants to support our mining operations. We need to use renewable energy because, of course, if we're building mines to support the energy transition, we need to make sure that they are green as well. So the cost of building and operating these mines is higher than it's been in the past. But one of the biggest rate-limiting steps here is just the time it takes to secure permits for mines now. That's more complex than it's ever been. It's complex in part because of the societal expectations. I'm not suggesting for a moment that we should short-circuit the process in terms of doing the work around environmental baselining and ensuring we are meeting the needs of communities and indigenous nations. That is critically important for all of future mine development. But what we do need is predictable permitting processes that we can rely upon to move these mines or proposed mines efficiently through the process so we get them to a phase of production. So that needs government support in terms of the regulatory frameworks around mining and policies. Governments, I think, need more deliberate industrial strategies to indicate how they're going to support mining and investment in mining in their countries. And of course, we need capital to develop these mines. And the flow of capital into mines that will have higher capital costs in the future and higher operating costs in the future will require higher commodity prices. And unfortunately, commodity markets work on the price of today's supply and demand balance rather than the price of tomorrow's supply and demand balance, which is what we're trying to deliver into. So we need to rethink, to a certain extent, pricing mechanisms here that will support the investment that we need for this development.
Great, thank you. Kgosi, if I could turn and ask a similar question to you. Jonathan made reference to the importance of countries having industrial strategies, having regulatory frameworks, countries that have great potential to further develop their mining resources. Would you be able to say anything about South Africa in particular? And then, of course, the G20 and how the G20 might be looking at some of these issues related to the energy transition.
Thank you very much, and good morning to the delegates. Maybe just to how you frame the conversation to make the following points as I link it to the question. The first one is that the question of the energy trilemma has got regional or geographic manifestations. I mean, if you come to the continent, we have about 600 million people who don't have access to electricity. And therefore, the conversation about the transition essentially is a misnomer. It's non-existent because they don't have access to electricity. But we also see opportunities. So what are those opportunities that the kind of investment and maturity of technology has made it possible for us to connect the poor, those who are located in far-flung areas, the rural hinterland. We are able to connect them quicker and cheaper because you don't necessarily need the kind of backbone infrastructure for you to connect these communities. But also we know that Africa is home to about 30% of known mineral resources. So the ability for us to be able to exploit these minerals in the context of supporting the transition, I think is going to be key because we're likely going to broaden the flow of industrial production, and in that way, we are able to power the economies of those countries, get people out of poverty, ensure that they've got skills to participate in the new economy. So the question is, how do you exploit those resources? So I think the point made earlier on is first you need the capital because this is a capital-intensive industry, and we know that the balance sheet of these countries is not sufficient for them to self-finance. So you need to create a dispensation where you are able to tap into the deep liquidity that is sitting with the private sector for those investments to happen. And those investments must happen close to source because what we have been doing over time, we've been exporting opportunities, so essentially employment opportunities. So the relationship is that of extraction. So you take these mineral resources, beneficiation, value addition takes place in far-flung areas. So I think there has to be that conversation, especially with the major industrial powers, to ensure that you support the growth of these countries, invest in them, and ensure that the beneficiation happens closer to the source. But for that to happen, there has to be political stability. And in many of these jurisdictions, unfortunately, we have seen unstable political environments that makes it difficult for investors to come into those spaces and make the necessary investments. And that's why we're having this conversation on the continent. They need to ensure that we're able to entrench, deepen democracy. And we have seen that there's been a number of elections that have taken place on the continent. And these, by many accounts, were declared to be free and fair, with the exception of Mozambique, where there was a bit of tension. But I think we're beginning to resolve that question. With South Africa assuming the presidency of the G20, the first sovereign African nation to assume that position, I think we're going to elevate, if you like, the opportunities on the continent and the need for the continent to coalesce around a set of objectives that makes it possible for us to articulate in the most coherent and comprehensive fashion what constitute the aspirations and the needs of the continent. So we see the G20 presidency not just as a South African presidency, but as a presidency of the continent. And that's why we're having our own conversation, at least on the technical side of the Energy Working Group, canvassing the opinions of my peers on how best to position and articulate our views when we enter into those conversations. And yes, I think the G20 is a pristine platform for Africa to showcase what the potential that it has But for that to happen, we need to organize ourselves better and have a much more coherent articulation of what constitutes that transition. But I'm confident that with our presidency, we'll be able to surface exactly what that means, and ensuring that the issues of access are elevated in addition to the issue of security and the issues of sustainability. And that's the trilemma I was referring to earlier on.
Great, thank you. Mohammed, if I could ask you about the role of oil and gas. So we talked about the shifting attitudes of the energy transition, and certainly that has accompanying shifting attitudes towards the role of oil and gas in the energy transition. All of us in the room who have watched or participated in the Conference of the Parties, we saw at the COP28 a real grappling with the role of oil and gas in the energy transition, but then we saw the absence of addressing this explicitly in COP29. Could you give us a sense of how you see the shifting role of oil and gas in the energy transition, and what you perceive as the drivers of those impressions and realities?
Well, thanks, Meghan. I thought I was going to be given the easiest question. I don't want to come off sounding like I'm an apologist for the fossil fuel industry. I'm sitting on the same panel with Fatih, for God's sake. We've had many exchanges here. I think what has happened within the last decade is a collision between idealism and economic realities. And I think that cuts to the heart of the trilemma that Excellency Minister from South Africa referred to. I think Maria mentioned also the push for getting energy security front and center. This has been a recurring subject matter. And the reality is, notwithstanding what has happened post-pandemic, Fatih will confirm his research, as well as research of many other multilateral institutions, show that energy demand is on an uptick, particularly in Asia, where I am from. We've seen this grow from the beginning of this century at 2 to 3% at a steady pace. The reality is that governments have to shape policies and support industry. They have to make sure that families are fed, hospitals work, transport continues. But post-pandemic, when there was indeed an uptick in this, and of course we were hit by what internally in PETRONAS we call a state of polycrises, crises of policy changes, shifts in funding standards, shifts in permitting, shifts in geopolitics, most evident after the incursion in October 7th in the Middle East, and of course the Ukraine invasion. All of these have commingled to make very difficult signals to read. But the realities are that governments, particularly those in Asia, where there's 350 million people still without regular access to electricity, whereas Fatih has rightly pointed out, places where people are still struggling to have cooking fuel, the response is that we need to get something to the people, to the masses, to ensure they can continue economic activity, they can actually generate industry, healthcare systems are supported, and the reality is that this comes with accepting oil and gas. But as an industry, have we accepted that we can continue producing oil and gas the same way? I think the answer is a very strong no. We acknowledge that we have a duty to correct the issues such as methane, which are far more a potent GHG gas. And reality is that in Asia, where ASEAN in particular, where we're the home to 700 million people, we're spread across 25,000 islands, 130,000 kilometers of coastline. Pretty much we're having people face up and bear the brunt of being climate refugees year in, year out. And these are realities that hit us here. But why we're gathered here in Davos, I think that the subtitle is Committed to Improving the State of the World, is we want to exchange these approaches. And at the end of this, at the end of the day, I think governments accord the space for fossil fuels and oil and gas in particular, the reality of 85% of the energy mix still being very much fueled by fossil fuels in Asia, it's difficult to shift overnight. And just latching on finally, just to close out, Jonathan's remarks about the realities around permitting and lag time and the capital hurdle you must overcome. The system B that we idealistically want to have in place isn't there yet. And we just have to make sure what can be offered by system A is done in a very differentiated manner. We just have to accompany it with CCS. We have to deal with methane. We have to completely avoid flaring and venting. And more so, companies like myself, a national company, are charged to become more like energy superstores. Because as we deal with the energy needs of our constituents and markets and partners, they're asking us for combinations. You can't give us only a fossil fuel solution. Could you accompany it with lower carbon ammonia? Could you accompany it with a renewables solution? So these things are working out and evolving over time. There is a space, indeed, and I would argue with Fatih that there is still a space for oil and gas for at least a while yet, but we're not going to do it in the same way.
Great.
I agree with you there. No problems. May I just say something?
Sure.
So, just three small points to reacting to the colleagues. First, about energy transition means different things for different parts of the world. I'll give you one example. We have the Dutch minister here, so I saw the Dutch climate envoy. So I tell you, today, just for me, one of the most tragic statistics, I make my hands dirty with data every day, but one of the most tragic statistics I'm going to tell you. Today, solar is the cheapest source of electricity generation almost everywhere, especially in Africa, where we have 40% of the solar radiation in the world comes to Africa, 60% everybody else put together. Yet, in Africa, as Mr. Minister mentioned, as IEA has been looking since 20 years, 1 out of 2 persons don't have access to electricity. And yet, amount of solar power we generate in the entire sub-Saharan Africa is less than we have in Netherlands. Think about the map. How big is the sub-Saharan Africa is, and the Netherlands is a great country, but a small one compared to sub-Saharan Africa. Mr. Minister, I'm sure you agree with me. So this is when you look at the comparison, this is really very unfair when you look at it from the more humanitarian perspective. This is number one. Number two, I think the question of should we choose energy security or energy transition, we should think twice. Do we really have to choose one of them? I don't think so. This reminds me, when I was a child, 7, 8 years ago, it was many years ago, I was annoyed with a question getting from the neighbors and the aunts and the uncles. Do you love your father or mother more? Very tough question. What are you going to say? Depends on who is in the room at that time. So why do I have to choose one of them? I love both of them. So I want to address both energy security and address the environmental problems. And this can happen. And there's a role for oil and gas there in the transition period. This is number two. Number three, on the critical minerals, especially copper. So copper is, I think the importance of copper is not well understood, energy transition or not, because we are seeing electricity demand is growing very strongly, 6 times higher than the energy demand, electricity demand. It means copper. Yet when we look at the investments and the demand, we see a big deficit, and a copper mine, A to Z, you need 17 years in order to develop, bring the copper to the market. Big problem. And finally, Meghan, I want to say that in terms of critical minerals, in terms of the diversification, we shouldn't only look at where the mining is, but where the processing and refining is. 80% of the critical minerals today in process in one single country. So therefore, diversification for the source of minerals, but diversification of the processing as well, as you with Jason wrote about this.
Yeah, it's a very, very important point. I'm just going to very quickly ask one last question to the panel, then open up for a few questions before we close out. And I'll direct this to anyone who would like to respond to it. But it has to do with the shifting winds in trade. And that certainly we know that the energy transition would involve a lot of change in the patterns of trade, the composition of trade as it relates to energy. The IEA has mapped this out very, very clearly. But we also have seen big changes in the last few years and a shift towards protectionism globally speaking. With President Trump coming into office, he's made it very clear that tariffs, he has said tariff is one of the most beautiful words in the English language. And so this is going to be a real policy tool for the Trump administration. So what is this shift towards protectionism meaning for the energy transition? I'd like to see if there's anyone who would like to comment on that. I see, Jonathan, you're nodding your head if you want to start.
Look, I mean, I think we've operated for decades in global commodity markets, and they've been transparent and they've been efficient, and it's a good way to match supply and demand. And to Fatih's point, it's a good way of matching mine capacity with processing capacity. But we found ourselves in a position where, again, you know, in the case of copper, 50% of that is processed in China, and governments in the West have begun to feel very uncomfortable about that fact. And as governments are pursuing economic security, energy security, national security, what they realize they need now is resource security to back that up, hence this drive to regionalization. You know, your point on tariffs, I mean, you know, that's a concerning one, because what tariffs will do is drive inefficiencies into the system. They will drive higher costs, they will drive inflation, and ultimately they will drive lower growth. And our concern is that the inflationary impact in particular will slow down the pace of the energy transition. On the other hand, you know, there are some regional opportunities here where, you know, neighboring countries, and, you know, I speak from a Canadian perspective with the world's largest market on our southern border, there's an enormous opportunity there to match the resource capability that Canada has with the market opportunity we see in the US, but that needs to be done on the basis of the free flow of trade, the free flow of minerals, and the free flow of capital across that border to support that. So in these instances, there are risks, but I do think there are opportunities that are emerging where we can work in collaboration locally, but we shouldn't close ourselves off to global markets, because they do drive efficiency in investment, and they drive efficiency that will allow us to pursue the energy transition more quickly.
Just to make one point.
Sure. I'm just going to ask people to be very brief, because I do want to take a few questions from the floor.
I just want to make the point that this protectionism takes different manifestations. I mean, if you go to the European Union, the introduction of CBAM, I think they present an existential challenge to some of our industries. And therefore, they are going to lose out their access to those markets and result in the decimation of those industries in our countries. I'm saying that the conversation needs to be a bit more nuanced. I mean, the juxtaposition of renewable energy resources, the Netherlands versus the continent, I think there's an additional dimension there, is the ability to invest in the opportunity to exploit those renewables. These countries don't have the necessary balance sheet to support that kind of investment, and we rely on private sector to come and make the necessary investments. But we also have an obligation as sovereign jurisdiction to create conditions for that investment to land there.
Great, thank you. Maria, you wanted to comment on this point about protectionism?
I want to comment on the previous, on the renewables on Africa. Can I comment on that very shortly?
I'll just ask you to be very quick, and then if anyone, could you just signal to me if you have a question? I'll take a few.
I would like to say that one of our policies has been the cooperation with the African countries and the Portuguese speaking, and we have a very good project going on conversion of debt that we have established to Cabo Verde, and now we are going to establish also to Saint Tomé and Príncipe, where we convert the debt in projects on, in the case of Cabo Verde, on solar energy. It's already done for 2 years, and we are going to continue with projects with solar photovoltaic with water. So it's a very good model that can be applied to other cooperations between countries. So it's a very good example that we can head each other for a more swift transition.
Great, thank you. I think I'll take three questions all at once. I'll go here, here, and then there.
Hello, I'm John Chipman, Executive Chairman of the IISS in London and also Senior Advisor to Centricus. To the head of PETRONAS a few weeks ago in the Leaders Summit between Prime Minister Wong of Singapore and Prime Minister Ibrahim of Malaysia, a long-held dream of the King of Johor was implemented with the creation of this Johor-Singapore Economic Zone, and there were incentives given to companies to invest there in AI, and as Meghan said, AI is one of the greatest consumers of energy. Do you anticipate that that large economic zone will be a center for renewable energy activity, and would PETRONAS engage in that in order to realize your dream of eventually becoming an energy superstore?
Most certainly, I think central to any national oil company's duty is to ensure energy security, and we're almost duty-bound to ensure that economic activity can proliferate. Now, the creation of the economic zone, and I believe my Prime Minister is here, the question can be leveled to him directly. He wants to make sure, as the chair of ASEAN this year, that any economic development is done sustainably and inclusively. So not only is it aimed to actually ensure that the locality flourishes, but we need to do what we can do within a reasonable time frame to shift the energy that powers this from one that is grey to one that's far greener. The transition is going to compel companies like ourselves to start thinking about our solutions and offerings. And of course, we're partnering with national utilities and private investors to make sure that this growth of data centers, which I know is proliferating at a, I would say, an exponential rate, this in itself is both a reason for debate, risk and reward of carrying out this much data center growth in Asia. I think all our demand curves are now wrong. I think we've seen this in the US. I think we've seen this in anywhere there we've taken on data center investments. The AI unto itself is a consumer, and we hope that the virtual cycle will then help energy management. It may come later, but there is going to be that hump that we have to deal with, and we have to do so sustainably. And of course, PETRONAS will be part of that equation.
Thank you.
I'm Suman Mishra, Managing Director of Mahindra Last Mile Mobility, EV manufacturer. Question to you. Given this panel, it was very clear that there are really practical constraints on whether it is energy access, energy security, capital access, etc. And the answer is going to be very different depending on which part of the geography you are sitting at. So my question is, acknowledging these practical challenges, what is the governing framework or policy approach or mechanism which will then ensure energy transition, which will hopefully be expeditious and potentially just? So, thank you.
Great, thank you. I'll take one more question and then we'll wrap up in the panel.
Tatsuya Terza from Japan. I have a question to Dr. Birol. You mentioned that energy transition is not a rival to economic security. And you also mentioned that economic transition will lead to prosperity. But the reality may be slightly different. No. If we go ahead with energy transition, more solar PVs, more batteries, more EVs, and China will be more dominant. In terms of prosperity, with my due respect to my German friends, Germany has been the leader in energy transition, but the result is higher energy costs, hollowing out of the industry and loss of competitiveness. You said if you do it right, you can satisfy everything, but can you be more elaborate and specific in what is the appropriate manner to ensure that economic transition will be consistent with energy security and lead to prosperity?
Thank you. So Fatih, I'll let you take that.
I can take...
Actually, if you take them both, the governance frameworks, yeah. And if you could do it in 1 minute, that would be even better.
Okay, 30 seconds each. So I don't think that there will be one governing body around the world which will take the decisions and define the roadmap for the entire world. Every country will be different. They have different advantage and disadvantage when it comes to economy, resource endowment, policies, priorities. Every country is different. But countries who do not see the real trends in terms of technology, in terms of innovation, and tomorrow's the industry, they may be losing time and they may not be positioning their economies good for the next chapter of the economy. So therefore, we should make sure that if we look at the realities of today, what are the energies of today, but at the same time, what is coming on, and prepare the economy for that. My Japanese colleague, for example, one concrete example I can give it to you. Nuclear power in Japan or nuclear power in Germany. I think in Germany, German government or German people, I respect their decision to phasing out of nuclear power was a historical mistake. If they didn't do so, because the German nuclear power plants they were working like a Swiss clock without any problem. And after the 2011 Fukushima accident, we saw this coming also in Japan. They were wrong policy decisions, and they shouldn't be considered as going through a transition. In my view, in Germany, shutting down the nuclear power plants did not help to a healthy and well-designed energy transition policy in Germany, and therefore led, among others, higher electricity prices. Just to give you one example, we shouldn't be dogmatic, we should be pragmatic, we should deal with today's energy security challenges, such as oil and gas, but also tomorrow's, as I mentioned before, concentration of the processing of critical minerals in one country is a big challenge, but we should find ways in order to diversify it, and having processing facilities around the world is not difficult. So this shouldn't be a reason not to go for transition, that today the processing is one country concentrated. Just the opposite, we should go for transition, but at the same time take the steps in order to first recycle, and the second, for the processing, we should try to do it, and it is happening now in many countries around the world, to diversifying. As I said, for me, the magic word for energy security is diversification.
With that, unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you so much for the many questions that I know remain unanswered. I think one thing that is clear coming out of this panel is that there are still many opportunities related to the energy transition to be considered. And then as we grapple with this relationship between energy security and the energy transition, we know there are many different potential paths to a net zero global economy. And we need to focus more clearly on the ones that are more compatible with energy security for all, rather than other paths which might seem easier or faster or more expedient in the short term, but may not be commensurate with energy security. With that, I'd like to thank everybody in the room, particularly like to thank our panelists for a fantastic job. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Excellent. Well done.